The sky did not tear open all at once. It never does. It darkened first, slowly, like a bruise spreading beneath the skin of the world, and the men around me noticed it only in fragments. A flicker in the clouds that did not match the wind. A taste of copper at the back of the throat. The sudden, inexplicable urge to whisper prayers we had not spoken since childhood. I was standing in the mud of a forward trench, lasgun heavy in my hands, when I understood with quiet certainty that the war we had trained for was over, and something far worse had already begun. Chaos does not announce itself with banners or horns. It arrives as realization, and by the time you recognize it, you are already inside its shadow. If you are here, if this moment has drawn your attention and settled its weight on you, then stay with me. Mark this story, pass it along, and subscribe, not out of habit, but because there are memories that do not fade unless they are shared, and voices that should not be allowed to vanish into the static of the warp. The night began with rain, the thin, oily kind that never truly washed anything clean, only spread the grime more evenly across armor and skin. It slicked the mud at the base of the trench until every step threatened to steal a boot, and it pattered against my helmet with a sound too soft to be comforting. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the rain felt wrong, warmer than it should have been, carrying a faint metallic tang that lingered on the tongue. The sky above was a low, oppressive ceiling of cloud, glowing faintly with reflected lumen light from the rear lines, and somewhere far off artillery thundered with the dull regularity of a tired heartbeat. We had been on rotation for 3 weeks by then, long enough for the trench to feel less like shelter and more like a second skin. The smell of wet earth, promethium residue, and unwashed bodies clung to everything. My lasgun rested across my knees as I sat on an ammo crate, fingers numb despite the gloves, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the wire. There was nothing out there I could see, nothing that justified the tightness in my chest. But that was how most nights went. You learned to live with unease in the Astra Militarum. It was as much a part of the kit as your flak armor. The Vox crackled beside me, its rune lights steady and reassuring. Sergeant Halvek stood a few meters down the trench, hunched over a data slate as he checked the latest orders, his silhouette sharp against the dim glow of a lumen strip bolted to the trench wall. He was a veteran, the kind that survived not through heroics, but through a stubborn refusal to die, and his presence alone did more for morale than any speech. When he looked up and caught my eye, he gave a brief nod. "All was well," the gesture said, "as well as it ever was." Then the Vox clicked, and everything changed. At first it was subtle. A burst of static cut across the usual low murmur of traffic, sharp enough to make me flinch. The rune lights flickered once, then steadied. No one reacted immediately. Vox interference was common near the front, especially during heavy bombardment, and this sector had been restless for days. I leaned closer, adjusting the receiver by habit, waiting for the familiar cadence of command chatter to resume. It did not. The static deepened, becoming a low, grinding hiss that drowned out every other frequency. I could hear voices beneath it, distorted and stretched, syllables bleeding into one another until meaning was lost. Sergeant Halvek straightened, his posture shifting from weary to alert in a heartbeat. He tapped the side of his helmet, adjusting his own receiver, then keyed the Vox. "Command, this is Forward Trench Delta 7. Say again, you're breaking up." There was no response. The hiss swelled, then cut out entirely, leaving a silence so abrupt it rang in my ears. The rune lights on the Vox dimmed, then went dark. Silence at the front line is never a good sign. Around me, the trench seemed to hold its breath. Men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, at the sky, at the inert Vox unit, as if it might spring back to life if stared at hard enough. Someone laughed nervously, a short, brittle sound that died almost as soon as it began. Sergeant Halvek moved quickly now, barking quiet orders to check secondary channels, to run diagnostics. A trooper down the line smacked the side of his receiver with the heel of his hand, muttering a prayer to the Omnissiah under his breath. Nothing worked. The longer the silence stretched, the heavier it became. Without the Vox, we were blind and deaf beyond our immediate surroundings, cut off from artillery support, from command, from any sense of the wider war. I tried to tell myself it was a temporary failure, some quirk of the weather or local interference. The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, but the sky seemed darker now, the clouds lower, pressing in. That was when the prayers started. It began quietly, one man whispering a familiar litany as he checked the charge pack on his lasgun. Another joined in, then another, voices overlapping in a low murmur that filled the trench with a fragile sense of order. The words were rote, drilled into us since induction, but there was comfort in their familiarity. The Emperor protects. The phrase had weight, even when belief wavered. Especially then. I found myself joining in without realizing it, lips moving on autopilot as my eyes strained into the darkness. The wire ahead glistened with rain, each barb catching what little light there was. Beyond it, the no-man's land lay empty, a churned expanse of mud and shattered debris stretching toward the enemy lines. It looked the same as it always had, and that sameness felt like a lie. A distant sound reached us then, so faint at first I thought it was another trick of the wind. A low hum just at the edge of hearing, rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. It was not artillery. It lacked the sharp concussion, the familiar warning whine. This was deeper, more resonant, like something vast moving far away beneath the surface of the world. The prayers faltered as others noticed it, heads turning instinctively toward the sound. "Does anyone else hear that?" someone whispered. Sergeant Halvek raised a hand for silence, his expression grim. He listened for a long moment, then shook his head slightly, as if unwilling to give the sound any more attention than necessary. "Stay sharp," he said quietly. "Probably machinery from the enemy side. Keep your sectors covered." We obeyed because obedience was easier than speculation. I lifted my lasgun, resting it against the lip of the trench, finger hovering near the trigger. The hum persisted, growing slowly louder, and with it came a sensation I could not immediately name. A pressure, not physical but internal, like a hand closing around the base of my skull. My mouth tasted of copper again, stronger now, and I swallowed hard, trying to clear it. The first flare of warp light split the clouds without warning. It was not lightning. I had seen lightning before, brilliant and brief, tearing the sky open for an instant. This was different. The clouds above us twisted inward, spiraling around a point of impossible darkness, and a sickly violet glow bled through the gaps. The light hurt to look at, setting my teeth on edge, and instinctively I ducked, heart hammering. Shouts erupted along the trench as men scrambled for cover, some crying out in fear, others barking orders that overlapped and tangled in the chaos. The hum surged into a roar. I pressed myself against the trench wall, mud smearing my armor, and risked another glance upward. The sky was wrong now, the clouds churning as if stirred by a giant's hand. The violet light pulsed, and with each pulse the pressure in my head intensified, thoughts slipping and sliding in ways that made it hard to focus. I heard laughter then, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the roar like a cruel joke. It was not coming from any one direction. It seemed to come from everywhere. "Emperor, preserve us!" someone sobbed. The ground shook as something impacted beyond the wire, a deep, resonant crash that sent waves through the mud. I felt it through my boots, up my legs, rattling my bones. Sergeant Halvek was shouting now, his voice strained as he tried to restore some semblance of order, but the words blurred together, half lost in the noise. I caught fragments. Hold the line. Weapons free. By the throne, fire. Shapes began to move in the no man's land, silhouettes against the warped glow of the sky. At first I thought they were enemy infantry advancing under cover of the storm, but as they drew closer, that assumption fell apart. They moved wrong, too fluid, limbs bending at impossible angles, bodies stretching and compressing as if the rules of flesh did not fully apply. My stomach clenched, bile rising in my throat. I fired without thinking. The laser gun bucked in my hands, its familiar snap and recoil grounding me for a heartbeat. Red beams lanced out into the darkness, striking one of the approaching shapes squarely in the chest. It staggered, flesh burning and sloughing away, but it did not fall. It laughed, the sound bubbling and wet, and surged forward faster than before. Others joined it, a tide of malformed figures spilling out of the shadows, their forms resolving into a nightmare of horns, claws, and too many eyes. Chaos had come to the front line, and it wore no single face. The trench erupted into disciplined panic. Men fired in controlled bursts, las beams stitching the darkness as Sergeant Halvek shouted corrections and target calls. Heavy weapons teams swung their emplacements around, autocannons thundering as they tore into the advancing mass. Explosions flared, lighting the battlefield in harsh flashes that revealed horrors I could not fully process. Demons, the word surfaced unbidden, dragged up from half-remembered lectures and forbidden texts. The enemy was not just traitors or renegades. It was the warp itself, made of flesh. Fear clawed at me, raw and overwhelming, but training held. I reloaded on instinct, hands moving without conscious thought, and fired again. Each shot felt both futile and necessary, a gesture of defiance against something that should not exist. To my left, a trooper screamed as a clawed limb reached over the trench lip, dragging him screaming into the mud. The sound cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet crunch that turned my stomach. "Hold!" Sergeant Halvek roared. "Hold the line!" We did, because there was nothing else to do. The Emperor protects, I told myself again and again, clinging to the words like a lifeline. The violet light pulsed brighter, and for a moment I thought I saw faces in it, vast and leering, watching us struggle like insects beneath a lens. The pressure in my head threatened to split me open, and I bit down hard, tasting blood, just to anchor myself in the physical world. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the roar faltered. The shapes in the no man's land wavered, their forms blurring at the edges as if losing cohesion. The violet light dimmed, the clouds above shuddering and slowly unwinding. A final, echoing laugh rolled across the battlefield, filled with mocking promise, and then the warp light snapped out, plunging the world back into rain-soaked darkness. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Smoke drifted across the trench line, carrying the stench of burned flesh and ozone. Men slumped against the walls, panting, weapons still raised, afraid to lower them. I realized my hands were shaking violently, my grip on the laser gun so tight my knuckles ached. Sergeant Halvek moved among us, checking for the wounded, his face drawn and pale beneath the grime. The Vox remained dead. We waited for orders that did not come, staring out into the darkness where chaos had surged and receded like a tide. The rain continued to fall, washing blood into the mud, and somewhere deep inside I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was only the beginning. Dawn did not come properly after the first night. The sky lightened, but it did not clear, and the clouds hung low and bruised, stained faintly violet, as if the darkness had seeped into them and refused to leave. The rain slowed to a steady drip, collecting in the folds of our cloaks and the hollows of the trench, turning the floor into a sucking mire that pulled at every step. We counted heads in silence, and the numbers did not come out right. No one said anything about it. Saying names aloud felt dangerous, like drawing attention from something that might still be listening. The bodies were still out there, sprawled in the mud beyond the wire, where lass fire and autocannon rounds had torn them apart. In the gray half-light they looked unreal, shapes that did not quite resolve no matter how long I stared. Some were already dissolving, their edges fraying into smoke that drifted away on a wind I could not feel. Others remained solid, warped flesh cooling in the rain, proof that at least part of what we had fought was real enough to bleed. The sight made my stomach churn. I had killed men before. This was different. This felt like blasphemy made tangible. Sergeant Halvek ordered us to hold position. Without the Vox, without confirmation from command, there was nothing else to do. Runners were sent toward the rear lines, their figures quickly swallowed by the haze. We cleaned weapons, redistributed ammunition, and tried not to look too closely at the gaps in our formation. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move when I was not looking directly at it. It did not take long for the whispers to start. They crept in at the edge of hearing, too soft to be certain they were real. At first I thought it was just exhausted men muttering to themselves, prayers half-formed and broken by fear. But then I realized the cadence was wrong. The words did not follow any litany I knew. They slithered, syllables stretching and compressing, promising things I did not want to understand. I clenched my jaw and focused on the physical world, on the weight of my laser gun, the ache in my shoulders, the cold mud soaking through my boots. Across the trench, Trooper Venn was shaking. He was young, fresh from his first deployment, his flak armor still bearing the clean lines of recent issues beneath the grime. He stared out into the no man's land with wide, unfocused eyes, lips moving silently. I nudged him with my elbow, hard enough to get his attention. "Hey," I hissed. "Stay with us." He blinked, swallowed, and nodded too quickly. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word. He wiped at his face, smearing mud and rain together, and forced his gaze back to his sector. I wondered how long that would last. The next attack came without warning. There was no surge of warp light this time, no dramatic tearing of the sky. The ground itself began to writhe, mud bubbling and heaving as if something were trying to claw its way up from beneath the surface. The pressure in my skull returned with a vengeance, sharper than before, and I tasted blood as my teeth cut into my lip. Sergeant Halvek was shouting, but his words were drowned out by the sound of wet earth splitting apart. They rose from the mud like mockeries of men. These were closer to humans than the shapes from the night before, and somehow that made them worse. They wore fragments of uniforms, torn and fused into swollen flesh, Imperial Aquila twisted and half-absorbed into chests that rose and fell with labored, rasping breaths. Their faces were wrong, eyes too many or too few, mouths stretched into grins that split skin. Some carried weapons, lasguns warped and fused, firing beams of sickly, off-color light that scorched the trench walls where they struck. "Traitors!" someone screamed, and opened fire. We followed, lasguns barking in disciplined bursts, training taking over as terror threatened to overwhelm us. Red beams tore into the advancing figures, punching holes through corrupted flesh. They fell, some of them, collapsing into the mud with wet thuds. Others kept coming, ignoring wounds that would have dropped a man instantly. One clambered over the wire, its hands clawing at the trench lip, fingers ending in talons that scraped sparks from plasteel. I fired until my charge pack ran dry, slammed in a fresh one with shaking hands, and fired again. The smell of burned flesh filled the air, thick and cloying, mingling with the ever-present stench of mud and promethium. Autocannon rounds ripped chunks out of the advancing mass, scattering bodies and limbs, but still they came. Behind them, I glimpsed something larger moving in the haze, a towering shape that made my heart stutter. Faith broke then, not all at once, but in pieces. Trooper Venn screamed and dropped his weapon, clutching his helmet as if trying to tear it off. "They're inside my head," he sobbed, voice high and panicked. "They know my name." I reached for him, but Sergeant Halvek was faster. He grabbed Venn by the collar, shook him hard enough to rattle teeth. "Eyes up," he roared. "You drop that gun again and Emperor help me, I'll put you down myself." For a heartbeat, I thought Venn might turn his weapon on us even without holding it, that something behind his eyes would take control. Then another lass beam punched through his chest from the front, dropping him backward into the mud. One of the corrupted figures had fired from beyond the wire. Venn's body twitched once, and went still. There was no time to mourn. The thing over the wire hauled itself into the trench, towering over us, its bulk distorting the space around it. Its skin was a patchwork of scars and lesions, weeping fluids that hissed where they hit the mud. It swung a massive arm, backhanding a guardsman hard enough to snap his neck with a sound I felt in my teeth. Panic surged, hot and blinding, and for a moment the line threatened to collapse. Then the Commissar appeared. I had not seen him arrive, but suddenly he was there, coat flaring as he vaulted into the trench, bolt pistol already raised. His face was hard and set, eyes blazing with a fury that cut through the fear like a blade. He did not hesitate. He did not shout platitudes or promises. He shot the monster point-blank in the head. The bolt round detonated inside its skull, spraying the trench with fragments of bone and corrupted tissue. The creature reeled, bellowing in pain and rage, and the Commissar fired again and again until its head was nothing but a ruin. It collapsed in a heap, shaking the trench as it fell. "Stand fast," the Commissar bellowed, his voice carrying over the din. "You are the wall. You are the Emperor's shield. There is nothing here that your faith and your fire cannot break." For a moment, impossibly, it worked. Something in his certainty cut through the fog in my head, gave me something solid to cling to. The whispers receded, replaced by the familiar rhythm of orders and responses, of firing lines and overlapping fields of fire. I found myself shouting prayers again, not because I believed them more than before, but because they gave shape to my fear, turned it outward instead of letting it consume me. We pushed them back, meter by bloody meter. The corrupted figures fell, their bodies dissolving or burning away as the last of the warp energy bled out of them. The towering shape in the haze never fully emerged. Whether it withdrew or was never truly there, I could not say. Eventually the attacks faltered, then ceased altogether. The trench was a ruin. Bodies lay everywhere, Imperial and otherwise, piled in the mud. The rain washed blood into the drains, turning the water a dull pink. I leaned against the trench wall, panting, arms shaking with exhaustion, and realized I had been screaming without knowing it. My throat burned, my voice gone hoarse and ragged. The Commissar moved among us, checking positions, ensuring discipline held. He paused near me, his gaze sharp and assessing. For a moment, I thought he might say something, some word of commendation or warning. Instead, he nodded once and moved on, already focused on the next crisis. Faith, I realized then, was not a shield that made you invulnerable. It was a blade you held against your own throat, daring yourself to keep going when every instinct told you to run. It did not make the impossible possible. It made the unbearable survivable. As the smoke drifted and the rain continued to fall, Sergeant Halvek gathered us as best he could. We were fewer now, our line thinner, but it still held. The Vox remained dead, the silence beyond the trench heavy with promise and threat. I stared out into the gray haze, fingers tightening around my lasgun, and understood that whatever had come through the night was testing us. And it was not finished yet. By the third day, the trench no longer felt like a position. It felt like a wound that refused to close. Sleep came in fragments measured in minutes rather than hours, snatched while sitting upright with a lasgun across the knees, boots still sinking slowly into the mud. When I closed my eyes, I saw movement behind them, shapes forming and dissolving just out of reach. When I opened them again, the world looked thinner, as if the skin of reality had been stretched too far and left translucent. No one spoke about it, but I saw the same hollowed focus in the faces around me. We were all awake, even when we slept. The commissar ordered the dead moved before they could pile too high. That task fell to us. We hauled bodies to the rear of the trench and stacked them beneath tarps, Imperial and otherwise, though it became harder with each passing hour to tell the difference. Some of the corrupted corpses dissolved when touched, sloughing into foul-smelling residue that burned the skin and left numbness behind. Others remained stubbornly solid, grotesque mockeries of men we might once have known. We worked quickly, silently, because lingering felt dangerous, like giving the world time to notice us again. Ammunition became a quiet obsession. We counted charge packs after every skirmish, redistributing what little we had left, checking power cells until our fingers ached. Resupply never came. The runners we had sent toward the rear did not return. At first we told ourselves they were delayed, taking shelter, waiting for a safe route. By the end of the second day, no one pretended anymore. The line behind us had either fallen or withdrawn, and we had not been deemed important enough to inform. Sergeant Halvek gathered us in the narrowest section of the trench, where the walls pressed close and the wind could not quite reach. His voice was rough from shouting and smoke, but it carried. "We hold," he said simply, "until we're told otherwise or until there's no one left to tell." No one argued. There was nowhere else to go. The attacks changed after that. They no longer came in surges or waves that could be anticipated and answered with drilled responses. Instead, they came in moments, sudden and intimate. A guardsman would scream and vanish from his post, dragged down into the mud by hands that should not have been there. A section of trench wall would bulge inward, flesh pressing through plasteel, as if the barrier were no more than skin. Each time, we reacted, firing, shouting, sealing breaches with frag charges and desperate prayers. But the pattern was clear. Chaos was probing us, learning, testing where we were weakest. The whispers grew louder. They no longer hid at the edge of hearing. They threaded through thought itself, offering clarity, rest, relief from the constant strain. I heard my own voice among them sometimes, or something that sounded like it, suggesting that if I simply lowered my weapon, if I stepped out of the trench and into the open, the pressure would stop. The idea horrified me, and that horror was the only thing that kept my boots planted where they were. Others were not so fortunate. A heavy weapons trooper named Karsk broke during a lull, climbing up onto the trench lip with a vacant smile on his face. He ignored our shouts, ignored Sergeant Halvek's order to get down, and raised his arms to the sky as if greeting a lover. The clouds above him churned, violet light flickering faintly beneath the gray. Before anyone could reach him, something reached back. His body twisted, lifted, and then came apart, scattering into the mud like dropped equipment. The whispers laughed, loud and triumphant, and several men retched where they stood. After that, the Commissar authorized summary measures. Any sign of hesitation, any indication that someone was listening too closely to voices that were not there, was met with immediate correction. A warning if we were lucky. A bolt round if we were not. It was brutal, efficient, and horrifyingly necessary. Discipline became the only thing standing between us and dissolution, and we clung to it with the desperation of drowning men. Reality itself began to misbehave. Distances warped. A stretch of trench that should have taken seconds to traverse felt like a kilometer, legs burning with effort that made no sense. At other times, I found myself somewhere I did not remember walking to, my last clear memory several meters behind me. The sky flickered between shades that had no names, and shadows fell in directions that did not match any light source. Once, I looked down at my hands and saw them wrong, fingers too many, joints bending in ways they should not. I blinked hard, recited the litany of true form through clenched teeth, and the illusion shattered, leaving me shaking and soaked in sweat. Hunger gnawed at us, sharp and constant. Rations ran low, then ran out entirely. We chewed nutrient blocks salvaged from fallen packs, shared sips of recycled water thick with mud and blood. The weakness made it harder to focus, harder to maintain the internal walls that kept the whispers at bay. I learned to recognize the moment before my thoughts began to slip, a subtle loosening that signaled danger, and forced myself back through sheer stubbornness. The Commissar noticed. He cornered me during a rare lull, his gaze sharp and unblinking. "You're holding," he said, not a question. "Yes, sir," I replied, because anything else felt like an invitation to die. He studied me for a long moment, as if weighing something invisible. "Good," he said at last. "Then keep holding. Others are watching you." The idea unsettled me more than any whisper. I did not want to be an example. Examples drew attention. The next assault came at what passed for night, though the sky never fully darkened anymore. A red glow pulsed beneath the clouds, steady and slow, like a vast heart beating out of time. The ground trembled with each pulse, and I felt it echo inside my chest. Shapes emerged from the haze, more organized now, moving with purpose rather than frenzy. These were not the warped remnants of men. These were deliberate. They advanced without sound at first, then began to chant. The words were not in any language I recognized, but their meaning pressed into my mind regardless. They spoke of inevitability, of the futility of resistance, of the joy that waited beyond surrender. The chant resonated with the pulsing sky, each syllable a hammer blow against my resolve. Men screamed and fired wildly, lass beams cutting erratic patterns through the fog. Some dropped their weapons and clutched their heads, sobbing. "Fire on my mark!" Sergeant Halvek roared, his voice hoarse but unbroken. "Hold your fire!" It was madness to wait, but we did. The chant grew louder, closer, and my vision blurred as tears streamed down my face unbidden. Every instinct screamed at me to shoot, to do something, anything, but I forced myself to breathe, to count heartbeats, to trust the man who had kept us alive this long. "Mark," we fired as one. The volley tore into the advancing figures, disciplined and precise, lass beams overlapping in a killing lattice. Frag grenades arced into the haze and detonated with concussive force, shredding bodies and breaking the chant into dissonant fragments. The red glow faltered, the pulse stuttering, and for a moment the pressure eased. We pressed the advantage, firing until barrels overheated and charge packs burned out. The cost was terrible. When the smoke cleared, the trench was half its former strength. Sergeant Halvek lay slumped against the wall, a ragged hole through his chest where something had struck him mid-command. His eyes were open, fixed on nothing, and I felt something inside me tear loose at the sight. He had been the constant, the anchor. Without him, the trench felt suddenly adrift. The commissar took command without ceremony. Orders were issued, positions reassigned, and the line stabilized once more. Efficiency replaced familiarity, and though it kept us alive, it left a hollow ache where trust had been. By the end of that cycle, I could no longer tell how much time had passed. Days blurred together, marked only by attacks and the spaces between them. I moved, fired, reloaded, and prayed in a haze of exhaustion that felt endless. The whispers never stopped, but they grew frustrated, sharper, as if angered by our refusal to break. I began to understand something then, a truth that settled over me with grim clarity. Chaos was not trying to annihilate us outright. It was trying to wear us down, to erode us piece by piece until we chose collapse ourselves. Every hour we held was an act of defiance, not just against an enemy, but against despair. As I stood my watch that cycle, laser gun steady despite the tremor in my hands, I looked out into the shifting haze and felt the weight of it all press down on me. The world was unraveling, thread by thread, and we were clinging to the last strands with bloodied fingers. Somewhere beyond the clouds, beyond the whispers and the warped light, the wider Imperium might still exist. Reinforcements might still be coming. Or this trench might be all that remained. A forgotten line held by men who refused to let go. I tightened my grip on my weapon and waited, knowing that whatever came next would demand more than survival. It would demand meaning, and I was no longer certain how much of that I had left to give. The first rumor reached us the same way everything else did now, broken, distorted, and carried on voices that no longer trusted their own ears. A voxcaster was recovered from a collapsed command dugout 2 trenches over, its casing cracked and its rune lights flickering like a dying pulse. It should not have worked at all. The machine spirit was clearly damaged, its auspex cycling through meaningless data, but every so often it caught something, a fragment of transmission bleeding through the static. We gathered around it in silence, mud-streaked faces lit by its weak glow, listening to words that might have been prayers or might have been warnings. Hold fast. By his light. Do not... The message cut out there, dissolving into a shriek of feedback that made several men clap hands over their ears. No coordinates, no identification codes, nothing that command would have been accepted as legitimate. And yet the effect on us was immediate. Men straightened slightly. A few crossed themselves with trembling fingers. The idea that someone, somewhere beyond this ruined stretch of trench, still spoke with purpose felt like oxygen after suffocation. The commissar allowed the vox to remain. That alone told me how dire things had become. Normally, unverified transmissions were a liability, a vector for corruption or panic. Now, they were all we had. He posted a sentry beside it and ordered that any sound, no matter how garbled, be reported directly to him. Faith, it seemed, was being rationed as carefully as ammunition. It was after that the sermons began. We had no ministorum priest attached to our unit. There had never been room in the deployment roster for one, not for a backwater front that had been expected to hold against conventional resistance at best. But faith does not always require an ordained voice. Sometimes it only needs someone desperate enough to speak aloud what others are too afraid to articulate. A corporal named Reth, older than most and badly wounded in one arm, began to recite passages from the infantryman's uplifting primer during the long lulls. His voice was rough, cracking with exhaustion, but the words carried. He spoke of the Emperor not as a distant god on Terra, but as a presence that endured alongside us, unseen yet constant. He did not claim miracles. He did not promise salvation. He spoke instead of duty as devotion, of holding the line as an act of worship in itself. No one corrected him. No one laughed. We listened because the alternative was to listen to the whispers instead. I did not know what I believed anymore. The Emperor had always been an abstraction to me, a symbol stamped onto banners and carved into the walls of Hab blocks. He was invoked in oaths and curses alike, omnipresent and impersonal. Here, under a sky that no longer obeyed its own rules, that abstraction felt painfully insufficient. And yet, when the pressure in my skull grew unbearable, when the whispers clawed at the edges of thought, it was his name that came to my lips unbidden. Not because I expected an answer, but because saying it reminded me of who I was supposed to be. The warp made its presence known in subtler ways now. There were no more dramatic tears in the sky, no great surges of demonic forms charging the wire. Instead, reality frayed quietly. The rain began to fall upward for several minutes at a time, droplets lifting from puddles and hanging suspended before drifting back down as if gravity itself were uncertain. Shadows detached from their owners and lingered a heartbeat too long before snapping back into place. Once, during a watch, I saw the no man's land transformed into a vast plain of bone, stretching to the horizon beneath a sun that burned green. I blinked, and the vision vanished, leaving only mud and wire and the ache of loss for something I had never truly seen. We learned not to react to these things. Reaction fed them. The commissar explained it in blunt terms during a rare address. "The warp wants attention," he said, pacing the length of the trench as men watched with hollow eyes. "It wants fear. It wants belief without discipline. You deny it by standing your ground and doing your duty. Nothing else matters." I believed him. I had to. Another rumor followed the first, carried by a runner who somehow made it back from the rear lines alive. He was half mad with exhaustion, eyes sunken and unfocused, but the words he spoke spread faster than any infection. He claimed that an astropathic choir had burned itself out trying to send a warning, that their last message spoke of a flare in the Astronomicon, a surge of light strong enough to blind those sensitive to it. He did not claim to understand what it meant. None of us did. But the idea that the Emperor's beacon still burned, still fought its way through the madness of the warp, lodged itself in our thoughts like a splinter. Some took it as a sign, others as a coincidence. A few whispered darker interpretations, suggesting that such flares came at a cost, that lives were being spent elsewhere to buy us time. Those whispers were quickly silenced. Speculation of that sort led only to despair, and despair was more dangerous than any demon. The next engagement was unlike any before it. There were no enemies to shoot, no chanting, no visible threat at all. Instead, the pressure descended without warning, a crushing weight that bent men double and drove screams from throats already raw. I dropped to one knee, gasping, my vision tunneling as something vast brushed against my awareness. It felt like standing beneath an avalanche held in suspension, knowing that if it fell fully, there would be nothing left. Images flooded my mind, unbidden and overwhelming. Cities burning beneath alien skies, choirs of psychers screaming in unison as their minds unraveled. A throne of impossible machinery, wreathed in light so intense it reduced thought to agony. I could not tell how much of it was imagination, how much rumor made manifest, and how much was something else entirely, bleeding through the thinning veil. I bit down hard, reciting the litany of true form until my jaw ached, anchoring myself to the trench, to my weapon, to the simple fact of breath in and breath out. Around me, men did the same, some shouting prayers, others simply screaming their own names as if afraid they might forget them. The pressure lingered, then slowly receded, leaving us shaking and soaked in sweat. When it was over, several men did not rise. Their bodies were intact, eyes open and staring, but whatever spark had animated them was gone. The medici servitors we no longer had would have called it soul burn, a term I had only half believed in before. Now, staring at those empty gazes, belief felt irrelevant. The commissar ordered them removed and burned. There was no time for rites beyond the briefest invocation of the Emperor's mercy. That night, as we stood watch beneath a sky that pulsed faintly with distant, unhealthy light, I felt something shift inside me. Not faith, as the sermons described it, not belief in deliverance or justice. It was smaller and harder, a recognition that the Emperor, whatever he truly was, represented continuity, the idea that humanity endured despite the warp, despite chaos, despite horrors that should have erased us long ago. Holding the line was not about expecting rescue. It was about refusing to let the story end here. The Vox spoke again just before what passed for dawn. "You are not alone. By his will. Endure." The transmission dissolved into static, but the words were enough. Men looked at one another, eyes reflecting the weak lumen light, and something like resolve settled over us. We were still cut off, still surrounded, still horribly outmatched. None of that had changed. But the rumor of the Emperor's gaze, distant and impersonal though it was, gave shape to our suffering. It made it part of something larger than this trench, this world, this invasion. As I took my position at the firing step once more, Lay's gun held steady despite the tremor in my hands. I felt the whispers retreat just a fraction, frustrated and hungry. They would return. I knew that. Chaos did not abandon a prize easily. But for now, under a sky that no longer obeyed reason, with rumors and prayers stitched together into something resembling hope, we remained. And as long as we remained, the line still held. The guns did not fall silent all at once. They faded, one by one, like dying stars blinking out of a poisoned sky. Autocannons ran dry and were abandoned where they stood, their barrels warped and smoking. Lay's guns clicked uselessly as their final charge packs bled out into nothing. Even the distant thunder of artillery, that constant reassurance that someone, somewhere, still knew we existed, dwindled into memory. What remained was a quiet so profound it felt artificial, stretched tight over the battlefield like a sheet pulled over a corpse. We did not cheer. No one raised a fist or shouted victory. We simply stood there, blinking, waiting for the next impossible thing to happen. Smoke drifted across the trench line in slow, lazy currents, carrying the smell of burned flesh, promethium, and something sweeter that turned the stomach. The sky remained wrong, clouds locked in a dull, livid gray that refused to break, but the pulsing light beneath them had dimmed to a faint ache, rather than a scream. The pressure in my skull eased for the first time since the invasion began. Not gone, never gone, but distant enough that I could think without gritting my teeth. Bodies lay everywhere. They filled the trench, slumped against walls, half buried in mud, tangled in wire where they had fallen trying to climb or escape. Some wore Imperial uniforms I recognized, faces frozen in expressions of shock or grim resolve. Others were things that had once been men, their forms twisted by corruption into shapes that barely resembled humanity. A few defied categorization entirely, dissolving even as I watched, their substance breaking down into ash and greasy residue that seeped into the earth. The battlefield was reclaiming them all with equal indifference. The commissar moved among us, his coat torn and spattered, bolt pistol hanging heavy at his side. He looked older than he had days before, lines etched deep into his face by exhaustion and something like grief he would never admit to. He issued orders in a calm, steady voice, directing survivors to establish perimeter watch, to check for signs of movement, to gather the wounded who could still be saved. Discipline held because it was all we had left. Without it, we would have collapsed where we stood. I helped carry Sergeant Halvek's body to the rear of the trench. It felt wrong to move him after leaving so many others where they lay, but he had been our anchor, and anchors deserved something more than the mud. As we lowered him beside the others, I felt a hollow open in my chest that had nothing to do with fatigue. He had not been a hero in the stories they would tell back on Terra. He had simply refused to break. That, I realized, was the highest standard most of us would ever meet. The wounded outnumbered our ability to help them. We tore strips from cloaks to bind bleeding limbs, shared the last of the Medici injectors among those who still had a chance. Some begged us not to bother, eyes glassy and unfocused, their voices already slipping away from the world. Others clung to us, fingers digging into armor, whispering names and prayers in equal measure. I stayed with a trooper whose legs had been crushed beneath a collapsed section of trench, holding his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped. There were no words that could make that easier. I learned that silence, offered honestly, was sometimes the only mercy left. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time had lost its shape. Eventually the Vox crackled again, louder and clearer than it had been since before the invasion. We froze, every head turning toward the battered unit as its rune lights flared weakly to life. The transmission was still distorted, still fragmented, but this time it carried something unmistakable beneath the static: authority. Astra Militarum elements. This is Relief Force Actual. Repeat, Relief Force Actual. A sound escaped my throat that might have been a laugh or a sob. Around me, men sagged where they stood, weapons slipping from numb fingers. Some fell to their knees, pressing foreheads to the mud, murmuring prayers that dissolved into tears. The commissar closed his eyes for a brief moment, then snapped them open and began issuing orders, his voice steady despite the tremor I could hear beneath it. Relief arrived at what passed for dawn. Armored silhouettes emerged from the haze, tanks grinding their way across the churned battlefield, their hulls bearing fresh Imperial Aquila, unmarred by corruption. Behind them came ranks of infantry, faces grim beneath helmets, weapons raised and ready. They took in the scene before them with the same stunned silence we had worn hours earlier. Medici teams followed, then servitors, then adepts bearing data slates and auspex arrays, already cataloging the aftermath with clinical efficiency. We were escorted from the trench like ghosts. They led us past the wire, past the bodies, past the scars carved into the land by artillery and warp fire, alike. I looked back once, unable to stop myself, and saw the line we had held reduced to a smear of mud and blood beneath a sky that refused to heal. It did not look like a victory. It looked like survival carved out of catastrophe by stubbornness alone. They separated us quickly after that. Those deemed fit were herded toward transport vehicles, wrapped in blankets that did little to chase away the cold that had settled deep in our bones. Others were taken to field hospitals, their fates uncertain. A few were pulled aside by robed figures bearing sigils I did not recognize, their expressions intent and unreadable. I did not ask where they were going. I did not want to know. Debriefing came later, conducted in a prefabricated command shelter that smelled of antiseptic and recaf. An officer with tired eyes asked questions in a flat, measured tone, recording answers that felt inadequate no matter how carefully I chose my words. How many contacts? What forms they took? Any unusual phenomena? Any signs of lingering corruption? I told him what I could, omitting nothing, because lying felt dangerous now. When he dismissed me, he did so with a nod that carried more respect than any medal. They did not send us back to the front. Instead, we were reassigned, dispersed across units that needed bodies more than they needed explanations. The invasion was being contained, we were told. The warp disturbances were receding. The line had held. That was the official phrasing, clean and efficient, stripped of everything that had made it real. I accepted it because there was nothing else to accept. On the transport off-world, I finally slept. It was not peaceful. Dreams came heavy and tangled, filled with images that blurred together. Violet skies, chanting figures, Sergeant Halveck's unblinking eyes. I woke, gasping, fingers clawing at the air, convinced for a heartbeat that the trench walls were closing in again. When the panic subsided, I lay there staring at the metal ceiling, listening to the hum of the engines, and tried to remember who I had been before the sky first darkened. The war followed me anyway. It followed me in the way sudden silences made my heart race, in the way whispers at the edge of hearing made me tense, even when they were only the murmur of other soldiers, in the way I found myself scanning shadows for movement that was not there. The medici called it combat fatigue, neural stress, a predictable outcome of prolonged exposure. They offered treatments, suppressants, prayers. None of it touched the core of it. What lingered was not fear alone. It was knowledge. I had seen the world unravel and hold together by inches. I had watched men break and others refuse to, not because they were stronger, but because something inside them would not let go. I had felt the warp press against my thoughts, promising release, and learned how close any of us were to accepting it without even realizing. That understanding settled into me like a second skeleton, reshaping how I moved through the world. There were moments, quiet ones, when I wondered whether chaos had truly retreated or merely turned its gaze elsewhere, whether the whispers had been driven off or were simply waiting for another opportunity. The rumors continued to circulate through the ranks, stories of other fronts, other worlds where reality had thinned and men had stood where we had stood. The Imperium endured, they said. The Emperor protects. I believed that endurance came at a cost. Sometimes, when the transport lights dimmed and the hum of the engines sank into a low, steady rhythm, I thought back to the trench, to the moment after the last shot was fired, to the silence that followed, heavy and absolute. There had been no revelation in that silence, no divine voice, only the sound of breathing, ragged and human, proving that some of us were still there. That, I decided, was what it meant to survive a chaos invasion as a guardsman of the Astra Militarum. Not to emerge unscarred or enlightened, but to carry on with the knowledge of how fragile everything was and how much effort it took to keep it from collapsing. We were not heroes carved into stone or sung about in hymns. We were witnesses, and sometimes that was worse. The guns had fallen silent, but the war had not truly ended. It had simply moved inward, settling into memory and muscle and reflex, waiting to be tested again. And when it was, I knew I would stand, lasgun in hand, because that was what I had learned to do when the world began to unravel. Not because I was fearless, not because I was faithful beyond doubt, but because I had already seen what happened when the line failed, and I would not be the one to let it break again.